briefly as you settle down. I think the previous panel was framed around new power equations, and we're going to talk mostly about ideology, and they certainly left us some of that in their discussions about religion and other subjects. We have a terrific trio, Suzanne Nossel, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch and worked at the UN with Dick Holbrooke in an interesting role, and Peter Skoblich, whose book I'm sure many of you know is really valuable. I assume it's for sale out there.
It is.
So he'll give us only a brief executive summary and leave much for you to digest on your trips home. And then Steve Weber, who reminded me that we met a few years ago, who's at Berkeley, and who brings, I think, an important perspective of the sort that makes convening in California so valuable for those of us who spend too much time in Washington, in his concentration on open source frameworks for business, but also government. And I think we're going to force him to talk about the application of those principles and ideas to foreign policy. So the question that frames our panel is them versus us, which picks up a little bit of Peter's book title. But I think what I'd like to do is just start by asking each of you to address a broad question to set our own panel in motion, which is, what are the ideological competitions that matter looking out over the next, pick a frame, 5, 10, 15 years, not too much longer than that, and why? And so among those that you might wish to address is the currently fashionable debate between those who see an emerging competition between liberal constitutional democratic orders on the one hand and authoritarian stroke capitalist models of the Russia-China ilk on the other. And to the extent that even within, for instance, the Democratic Party, there's been a very recent debate about whether a league of democracies or a concert of democracies is a wise idea or not. Those within the Democratic Party who advocated that are now backing away from it. McCain continues to advocate it. So it is a fresh framework, and it revives a much broader set of conversations about what are the ideological competitions that matter to statecraft in particular. And so maybe we'll start with Peter down there, since US versus them is literally your title. Maybe you can start us off.
Well, I guess I'd start off by saying that while I think there are certainly ideological conflicts in the world, the phrase or the term that's gotten the most play over the last 7 or 8 years is Islamofascism, or its variants, Islamic jihadism, or what have you. And obviously there are arguments that are happening at the level of ideas. But I don't think that going forward it's particularly useful to think of U.S. foreign policy or international relations in overly ideological terms, or perhaps not even in ideological terms at all. And I think that just to draw a little bit from history, even during that sort of quintessentially ideological of conflicts, the Cold War, where democratic capitalism was pitted against communism, it wasn't always particularly useful to see our struggle with the Soviets as ideological in nature. And in part that was because it tended to conflate our enemies, to draw all the communist states sort of into a single monolithic lump. So you had, not only the Soviets, but the Chinese and the North Vietnamese, and to sort of assign to these different actors similar interests, when in fact they often had differing interests, as we later learned when we developed relations with China. But more broadly, because it tends to cultivate or to facilitate this binary view of the world, this us versus them view of the world, in which the United States is on one side and our enemies, or even everybody else, is on the other. And the reason that's problematic is that as the world has and international relations have developed, maybe starting at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, and then certainly through the nuclear revolution and the post 9/11 world, our interests are ceasing to be constrained by borders, and we need a more cooperative framework in order to address threats. I'm not saying anything new here, but in order to address global warming or nuclear nonproliferation or terrorism for that matter, you cannot operate simply as a state acting on your own, even though we've tried to do that somewhat. You need cooperation that extends beyond your close group of allies. You need international institutions, you need norms and things like that. When you tend to see the world in terms of ideological conflict, that nurtures a binary view of the world, and that binary view of the world, I think, has by and large proven itself anathema to international organizations and norms and institutions, and really far more supportive of unilateral action and in particular military action. And I don't think that is what is going to protect the United States or solve some of the crises that we're facing now.
Well, Suzanne, as the Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch, you almost proceed from the assumption that there is, in some sense, maybe not in the sense that Peter was describing, a binary competition between those states and non-state organizations that honor the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and related commitments, and those that ignore them. So then how does the United States promote its version of those values, whether as an expression of its own interests or in pursuit of those values for their own sake?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to approach this speaking from a personal capacity, although I'll touch on how it ties together with my work at Human Rights Watch. I mean, I would agree with Peter that I think a binary frame is unhelpful. And to me, the question is, what approach does the U.S. take to promoting its values globally going forward? Because I think that's a dilemma that we must confront, and for many reasons. And I think we probably agree on this largely. There is an imperative, I think, as a matter of national security and rebuilding American leadership to find ways of promoting and supporting American values, human rights, democracy, freedom, the rules-based system. Both for external reasons in terms of advancing our national security and internally. If you look at the themes that resonate at both conventions, there's talk of American leadership, and American leadership for what? And if that has no values-based content, I think it's going to be pretty empty, and it's not going to mobilize and motivate voters and Americans and be a platform for the rebuilding of American leadership. The dilemma we face is that these traditional kind of progressive ideas and the notion of America having a role in the world, supporting, nurturing, and encouraging democracy and freedom has been deeply tainted. It was co-opted, all that language and rhetoric was co-opted by the Bush administration. I agree with John's point this morning that no objective person could characterize the Iraq invasion as motivated by a humanitarian impulse, but nonetheless, all of that language and all of those ideas were invoked in defense of a unilateralist, bellicose, militaristic intervention that has discredited us. And we now face the task of trying to kind of rebuild and reassert and reestablish those values against that foundation. And my concern is that we kind of throw out the baby of genuine American values with the bathwater of neoconservatism. And I think that's a real danger, and there's a real hesitancy. I think we saw this even over the last month in people's reactions on the progressive side to this conflict in Georgia, a real kind of reluctance to stand up for a democratic government and a sort of hesitation to resoundingly assert our support. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Nina, in asking me to participate, sort of said, can you touch on how we would go about this business of restoring an emphasis on American values? And I just want to tick through kind of four points that I think will be essential to doing this. And the first, and to me the foundation, not just for this, but for kind of any effective foreign policy going forward, is reestablishing American legitimacy. And that's not going to be done overnight. And I don't think it's going to be done simply with the election of a new president. I don't think it'll be that easy. I think the first kind of foundational step is you know, I would almost say do not attend your inaugural ball until you have the executive order written that's going to close Guantanamo and end secret detention and end torture. Because until we do that, no assertion of American values, no talk of American values is going to resonate. So that I see as kind of step one. Step two is devising means that don't end up discrediting the enterprise. I think if you look at the Bush administration, it's not that their goals in some cases were so wrong. Democracy in the Middle East, you know, political opening there, is something, you know, that's an important aspiration, and it's I think the right aspiration, but the means they unfolded that in were so wrong-headed and misguided and so incompetently carried out that the enterprise came into question. But that doesn't mean there aren't means at our disposal that can be more effective. Multilateral techniques, re-engagement with institutions, and we have promoted democracy successfully in many parts of the world. So there are models that we can look to for more effective means. Third point touched in the last panel is widening the circle of advocates for American values. And this is a more challenging task than I think people recognize. And I think that's why this proposal of a League of Democracies that John McCain is emphasizing is kind of misguided, because it presumes that there is this natural grouping of democratic nations from around the world who have shared values and are willing to project them with a sense of common purpose. And this ties directly to my work at Human Rights Watch. That's really not, it's not the case. I mean, what we find is opposition to our goals from really surprising quarters. I mean, South Africa has become a major antagonist and obstacle to the promotion of human rights through the UN, on Darfur, on Zimbabwe, and now on Georgia. They're Russia's biggest supporter in the UN Security Council on Georgia. So the notion that simply by convening democracies you'll have a group of like-minded nations prepared to act in concert, I think is mistaken. And unraveling that and mobilizing support and kind of trying to undo some of the forces that have led to where we are today, I think it's going to be a major challenge. I haven't even touched on, I think, also the fundamental challenge posed by China and just by the success they've achieved as a market economy with an authoritarian polity, and the fundamental challenge that poses. And then I think the fourth piece is kind of moral clarity and trying to kind of get back to a place where we are not so kind of clouded over by the impulse to toughness, by the kind of neo-realism of the left, that we can't call out aggression for what it is, and that we're afraid to respond to the incursion in Georgia with a kind of unadulterated defense of democracy. Because I think we need to reestablish that clarity in order to be an effective force for our own values going forward. I'll stop there.
Stephen, you, I would imagine, can complete this first round by trying to change the framework altogether. Okay. So, if you were to ask the question we began with, which is, what are the frames for ideological competition or language that would be most useful, say, for just the next president? Would you start in this conversation about liberal intervention and liberal humanitarian doctrine versus realism, or would you start someplace else?
Well, I'd start somewhere else. I find myself over the course of the morning in violent agreement with a lot of the comments that have been made, and it worries me, actually. Because I feel like we're at risk, and when I say we, I mean we broadly, of acting a little bit like the worried well, that we're sort of like the family on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that suffering a little bit of anxiety, so we spend a lot of time in the psychiatrist's office. But it's all okay, we've just got to fix a few things. I'm hearing a lot of language about reestablishing American leadership, re-legitimating the American purpose in the world, going back to X, Y, and Z. And it worries me because I think it's too late for that, actually. I think there's an element of nostalgia in that. And so let me try to shift the framework by actually taking issue with something that you said, Steve, earlier. You mentioned that you felt there was a sort of a good and useful rebalancing of discourse about globalization sort of in the late 1990s. I actually disagree with that. I don't think there was at all. I think that there was an attempt to kind of put some pretty language on top of what remained the kind of mythology of hegemony. So, my profession is absolutely at fault for this. We use phrases like, remember this phrase, primus inter pares? What the hell does that mean? I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. It might make you feel better about yourself, but it makes no sense as a guide to actually thinking about policy making, what policy making should be. And I think that it's a lot later than we think in those terms. So, I often ask people when we think back to like the last decade, people like to make lists of all the things that have gone wrong in American foreign policy. We have had two very, very lucky things happen to us, two great things for which we should be very grateful. One was the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which basically convinced people in large parts of the world that they needed to hold lots and lots and lots and lots of dollars. Okay? They don't believe it anymore. It never really, I mean, it may have made sense at some level, but in fact, it's way over the top, right? And, in fact, the sort of shift in that came when Larry Summers himself goes to India and says, what are you guys doing with so many dollars? You're not actually acting responsibly as a fiduciary to your own stakeholders. You're, earning 2.5% on a depreciating capital asset. There's something wrong here. And sort of people have sort of woken up. So the idea that the rest of the world believes that as a core element of its financial security, it must continue to take agency paper, treasury bonds, and US dollars, that's gone. The notion that there is going to be a significant reallocation, I think it's Powerig's that that's happening, and for very good reasons, and in fact, we even agree with it. But there's an even more fundamental mythology that we really need to understand for what it was and drop it, because we are the last people in the world to believe it. And that mythology is tied to a phrase or a word. Anybody remember Tina from Margaret Thatcher? Yeah, there is no alternative, right? So Margaret Thatcher had her thing she called Tina, there is no alternative. It actually came, she didn't develop it. It came from a set of scenarios that were done at Shell Oil in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And essentially, you can imagine what the argument was Tina is a world in which everybody believes, and that's the ideological part, everyone believes that liberal democracy as defined by the United States is, in fact, the best way to organize societies in the world order, et cetera, et cetera. We were very blessed with that mythology in significant parts of the rest of the world for a while. In fact, again, my own profession was complicit in this. We had this thing called regime theory, which told everybody else in the rest of the world that if they ever dared to kind of put at risk the American-sponsored world order of the post-World War II era, there was only one option: you go back to the anarchy of the 1930s. Now, this is a great thing for others to believe, right? Because what it says to them is, if you don't like what the United States is doing, it's always better to stay in the game and try to influence American policy than to try to go around the United States, root around the United States and do other things, because the alternative to American-led order is chaos. We're the last people in the world who believe that, right? Nobody else believes that. Well, maybe some people do. But the important players in the world don't believe that anymore. And so I think that fundamental change, those two fundamental changes, lead to a willingness to experiment with all sorts of new ideas and new concepts of world that have nothing to do with reestablishing and have nothing to do with relegitimating, but have to do with looking forward. And in some ways, the rising powers that Parag has talked about aren't burdened with those intellectual balls and chains. And this is good for them. So, I think that, to wrap this around, the first step to sort of talking about a new framework is to really look straight in the face the fact, those young people in Indonesia to whom we are trying, and I don't mean to single out Indonesia, I'm using it as an example, to whom we are trying to make an ideological appeal of meaning, justice, fairness, equity, equality, sustainability. They don't have pictures of John F. Kennedy over their fireplaces. They really don't, because they're 20 years old, right? And 1948 was 60 years ago. It's as far away for them as, like, 1860 is for us.
But isn't the other side of that observation that, which I don't think lives in conflict with it, that the nature of the case for a liberal constitutional democratic order is increasingly made by liberal democratic societies that are not in the American sphere of influence. So in India, in Brazil, in Southeast Asia, there is a discourse that may, as Indian democracy was originally influenced by British legacies that were complicated and not always helpful, it's now moved beyond that. It just as so I think it's not the end of that discourse, it's just the relocation of it. That's the sort of part of the example of the South Africa sort of role that you cited. But Peter, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't know where the locus of debate is necessarily on the future of the liberal democratic order. I think that going forward, the United States does not have to base a vision of future foreign policy on creating a liberal democratic order, which is not to say that we don't try to promote democracy where we can. But it is to say that I don't assume that foreign countries look to the United States automatically for moral leadership anymore, or for leadership generally anymore. But I do think there is a leadership role for the United States to assume, and that I would encourage it to assume, unless there is some brilliant idea coming from elsewhere. But I still think that because there is, a preponderance of power in the United States, and I do think there is, maybe it's just a residue of moral authority, but I do think that the world is not opposed to seeing the United States in a positive light again, that they would, not to generalize too broadly, but perhaps, welcome an excuse to see the United States in a better light than they've seen it over the last 7 or 8 years. And so I really think there is a role for U.S. leadership. And to come back around to something that was said in the last panel, I think it's a way to channel American exceptionalism in a positive direction, where American exceptionalism can have negative consequences in terms of leading to this kind of binary view of the world, where the United States sees itself as apart from everyone else, and that can lead both to an isolationism or to a unilateralism that we've seen over the last few years. I really think those are flip sides of the same coin. But exceptionalism can also be used to, at least in a domestic political sense, to motivate Americans to welcome a role in the world that is positive. The thing is that, in order to be a leader, others have to follow you. Otherwise, you're just some dude walking off into the distance.
Let me figure out if you and Suzanne disagree, because I'm not sure.
I'm not either.
Suzanne said what we should do is, A, put our own house in order, B, work multilaterally rather than unilaterally, but get back to reconstructing a values-based approach to foreign policy as one element of it. I'm not suggesting that it's a Wilsonian doctrine, but that it is affirmed as part of our foreign policy once we've taken those remedial steps. And I heard you say at the beginning that you didn't think a framing of that sort of any kind was necessarily useful. So are you sounding like a realist that you...
It's really easy to come across sounding like a cold-hearted realist when talking about it. At least it's easy for me. I don't know, maybe that's something. But I think that there is something of a slippery slope from starting from the premise that you have to view foreign policy through a moral lens and winding up looking at it through a moralistic lens. That is to say, it's, I would not suggest to anybody that we should not acknowledge the fact that there is both good and evil in the world. There clearly are, there always have been. At the same time, there always will be. And so while we recognize that, and I think we have to work with that on a case-by-case basis, you just can't take that as a frame for addressing U.S. foreign policy. Now, that's not necessarily an enormously satisfactory answer, I understand, because it doesn't provide
So just finish with a couple of case studies. Pick any others that you like. But suppose, take Egypt and Saudi Arabia as two examples. First Bush term, the administration is willing to put sort of typical realist equities at risk by lecturing these governments about change. Second term, scolded by realists, stops doing that.
Yeah.
Doesn't really end up with a better result, but it provokes less controversy. Where are you?
I mean, I think that you am I deeply offended that we do business with Saudi Arabia? Not necessarily. Not deeply enough that I would say, let's, somehow try to kick the Saudis to the curb in our foreign policy and move forward. Would I prefer an alternative? Obviously, yes. But let me take another case, which is intervention in Darfur. I think a moral policy would allow for or hope for intervention in Darfur. Does intervening in Darfur provide you with a framework for how you're going to address the rest of the problems the United States faces? I don't think so. I mean, there was a time when sort of the Clinton doctrine was going to be the ending of genocide throughout the world. Is that a moral policy? Yes. Is it a policy we should pursue? Certainly. Is it a frame for U.S. foreign policy? I don't think so. So I think to some extent the two have to be divorced.
Suzanne, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I go back to Peter's first observation, which is it's not binary, and I think it's that's the danger that we have to avoid, is kind of going back to a simplistic frame that's either or, when you have these very difficult conflicting equities pitted against one another. To go to the question of these governments, I think the issue is, what tactics can we use that are not going to backfire and that are actually going to serve the end of advancing our goals, without having ancillary effects that set us backward. And I think that's kind of the policy challenge.
You're a dangerous pragmatist then. So Stephen, you in listening to that, you sort of attempted to challenge the whole reliance on what you called two myths, and were worried about this very conversation about reconstructing approaches. Yeah. So then, having made those observations, what are the implications of your own observations for the advice that you would give in this set of advice? I mean, to the next president specifically, whether in reference to cases or generally.
I think Peter said something very important earlier on, when you said leaders need followers more than the other way around. I think you did say that.
Leaders definitely need followers.
That's good. I actually think that we ought to take that deathly seriously, and place it, in a sense, layered on top of your observation that the whole world is a publisher, right? So, I think it's fair to say that if it's not already true today, it will soon be true that YouTube has much greater influence over international narratives about events than any state government has ever had and will have in the future. There's a lot of alternative framing mechanisms available. And I don't know, I think of that competition as being extremely healthy, actually. Because we're very good. One of the things that Americans, I think, are very good at, we're sort of culturally good at it, we're organizationally set up to do it, is to compete, toughly, hardly, against lots of different, and I actually think when the competition fades away, when we get complacent, is when we get lazy stupid. And I fear that that's actually some of what happened to us in the 1990s. So if we then sort of say, hey, there are a set of demands out there, followers, potential followers who could be leaders, by the way, also, but are potentially looking to be led. And we actually, really listen to what it is that they're telling us that they want, rather than us trying to reform our past messages to make them sound more palatable to them. Well, then we're in a great position to actually meet that market demand. Now, one trivialized way to say that is public diplomacy was a bad idea. And of course it was. But if we really took seriously what we believe about that, and took really on board this notion that people know what they want. They know what they're looking for. And in fact, it's not what we think they're telling us, but it is actually what they are really telling us. Well, I think we'd be in a good position to fashion some core messages around that. When I say messages, I don't mean that in a pejorative. I mean that in reality, right? So what do people, I mean, do people want democracy right now, or are they attracted in many parts of the world to 9.5% growth rates? You know, we ought to answer that question for ourselves very seriously and take on board what we want to do about it.
Well, the problem is, of course, that in many of those societies, there's a competition between people who want to emphasize one or the other at the expense of the other. And so
I see almost no competition in China.
Really? Well,
I just don't see it. I think Americans wish it were there. I don't see it.
Well,
And I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm saying it's a real thing.
you don't think the detained population in China, in jails and prisons that are detained for public discourse of a sort that you would recognize, speak for a larger, quieter population than themselves?
Yeah, larger and quieter, but I don't know, that whole silent majority thing went out with the 1960s. I don't see it in Beijing. I don't see a clamoring for democracy. And I don't think this is a failing of the Chinese psyche. I don't think it's a retrograde form of political consciousness. I think it's a natural kind of sensibility for people in a particular phase of their lives, a particular phase of their national experience. I don't know where it's going to lead. I have no idea. I think the presumption that it necessarily must lead to a rise in democratic consciousness is a very dangerous sort of bet for us to make. I don't know.
I mean, just to come in there briefly, I mean, I would agree with the premise that you've laid out, that we need to listen and understand and proffer something that people around the world want, but we have to make sure that the people we're listening to actually have the freedom to speak. And you know, in China, that's not the case. And I think it's very dangerous to make a judgment about what they might say if they lived in a liberal society. And you know, I think that's quite fundamental.
I want to turn to questions, but just very briefly, if I could invite anyone who wishes to talk about the subject of religion that was handed up by the last panel. There was a way in which there would seem to be a consensus among the panel that religion is an instrument of other competition rather than an important ideological problem or framework in its own right. I wondered if that really was something that we would allow to pass, since it does have a little bit of that sort of attitude of not taking people's religious convictions and actions on behalf of faith quite as seriously as they seem to take it themselves. But how do you think about the inherited framework of a religiously tinted competition between the jihadi movement on the one hand and the liberal international order on the other? Peter, do you have anything?
I don't know. I guess I have a little bit of a wishy-washy answer, which is that it's easy to overstate it, and maybe the previous panel went a little bit far in overstating it. I mean, I don't think you want to try to understand, you know, Iran as a country without understanding it as an Islamic republic. I think you maybe lose some depth if you cease to do that. At the same time, you look at the jihadist movement as an ideological force, and you know, the Sunni extremism hasn't really succeeded in capturing a large swath of a population at the point where it gains control of a country, you know, putting aside the resurgence of the Taliban maybe. So I don't know. I think it's possible to really overstate it. At the same time, I wouldn't be dismissive. So as I said, that's a wishy-washy answer. But
do you want to say something?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think, you know, I'm actually not going to speak to this question of how we view the rest. I think the more interesting question we ought to be asking is, if this panel were taking place in Beijing or Lahore or anywhere else, what would they be saying about the United States when being asked the same question? Is foreign policy driven by religion? And I think we would be surprised at the degree to which many in the rest of the world view our engagement with the rest of the world as being very powerfully driven by religious
Absolutely
ideology.
right, yeah, certainly.
That's probably a more important thing for us to be talking about.
That's certainly evidentially, as a matter of empiricism, dead right, yes.
Regarding the religious thing, I'm an American of Iranian descent, and I just think it's important to look at the Straussian philosophy towards how religion is and used and should be utilized for essentially domestic purposes, whereas we're talking about Iran, state religion, Shiite Islamic Republic, and yet deals with heterogeneous states for pragmatic purposes, with India, which has multiple religions, with a technically communist atheistic China, however much Confucianism is coming back into vogue over there or not, as well as with European states for energy. I mean, I think they used religion for domestic motivation and control, but are much more pragmatic with regard to interstate relations, and I don't think we're really any different from that. Am I off, or?
No, I mean, I think you're saying something similar to what Stephen was saying, but it's to see religion as complicated and interacting with other subjects isn't to say that it doesn't matter in its own right. That's all. Yes.
On that subject, I'm glad you brought it back because I've lived in 4 different countries, 4 different religious spaces: Muslim, Hindu, so-called Christian, and now Confucian, most recently in Korea, where the emperor in the 14th century brought back Neo-Confucianism to impose a hierarchical, authoritarian government, which still today affects the way it's run. And I think that's why I'm increasingly uncomfortable with the way that our values-based attitudes seem to be taken over by one narrow brand of religion.
Well, Suzanne, could you just talk about where the promotion of religious freedom fits today in international discourse about human rights? Because we were talking much more in reference to liberal democratic constitutional orders. But, of course, part of the inheritance of the Bush administration's approach is an emphasis on freedom of religious practice.
Yeah, and I think they deserve some credit for putting more emphasis on that and actually backing that up with a government body that's dedicated to the promotion of religious freedom. Principally, I think it goes back to Steve's point about kind of the dialogue and how we engage with foreign societies and foreign peoples, and the degree to which religion is central to how they want to be understood, to how they want to evolve their societies. I think we need to understand that and relate to that and not be afraid of that and not minimize it and not kind of try to recast it as a political agenda in other clothes. And I think particularly on issues of women's rights in many of these societies, it really is central to whether those questions can be resolved and how. And it's something Human Rights Watch is putting more focus on, is being able to articulate our agenda through the lens of Sharia and to understand how religion needs to interact with how we try to promote these rights and values around the world. So I think there are ways of doing it. It's not a binary either or, but that engaging with it and not being afraid of it is critical.
Thanks. Blaise Anton with TCW. We're an asset management company here in LA. We invest in many of these rising countries, and I wanted to, first of all, say that I actually agree with Steve's comment. I do think there is an underappreciation in the U.S. for the desire of many people in these countries to improve their standard of living. And for most of them, it's about putting bread on the table or having a proper roof over their head more than it is about having the right to vote or the right to vote for someone that we would consider to be liberal in the classical sense. But my question actually goes to this issue of leadership and where does leadership end and coercion begin? And if we think about, I don't want to beat this dead horse of Georgia, but if we think about this issue of NATO enlargement, the summit that NATO had a few months ago saw severe disagreement between the United States on the one hand and Germany, France on the other hand regarding NATO enlargement to former Soviet republics, Georgia, Ukraine, and others. It seems to me that the Russians have clearly become quite paranoid about NATO enlargement and what they call their near abroad. Cheney is now stomping around in their backyard. It seems that the Ukrainian government has collapsed this week as a consequence. Where does John Podesta said earlier he thought NATO enlargement in the early 90s made sense. I'm not sure if he thinks that the Bush administration's approach at this point also makes sense. It's not clear to me whether Barack Obama has a strikingly different view from John McCain regarding NATO enlargement in the former Soviet republics. Where does leadership end? Where does coercion begin? And is this particular issue one that can actually be negotiated to everyone's ultimate acceptance?
What are the principles that are at stake in this case study, do you think? I think he's asking, in effect, there are a lot of ways in which you could approach this without principles.
Yeah.
But what are the ideological principles that are at stake?
Well, let me just turn that and put that forward as a challenge for the next administration, which I think, again, whether it be Democrat or Republican, will actually have to confront in a meaningful way. To a considerable degree, I believe it was the United States in the last 8 years that has really put on the table, opened up in a fundamental way, the question of what constitutes sovereignty in international politics and what rights and responsibilities come with that. We did it. We didn't solve that question, right? But we put that question on the table in a very fundamental way. And as I suggested, I think there are lots of folks out there who, for their own reasons, many of which we may see as illegitimate and they see as legitimate, are willing to experiment within that space that, in effect, we've created, right? So now we see that some of those experiments we really don't like. And that leads to, ironic and playful ironies and so on and so forth. But they're real. I mean, in other people's minds, those are really honest, compellingly felt narratives. Leadership means putting forward a new proposition, not because it's right or because we believe it, but because it's been negotiated with others who have the power actually to overturn it if they don't like it. So there's the opportunity, really, to address that directly with the people who actually have taken advantage of the space that we've created. On the other side of that, just very, very briefly, I would say, look, I mean, when it comes to where we ought to have been, I mean, if we're talking about ideological leadership, and there are elements of that in this issue, it's not the only thing at play, what was more important for American ideological leadership over the last decade, NATO enlargement or PEPFAR? PEPFAR was a lot more important.
Peter, Suzanne, you want to talk about Georgia as an ideological case study?
I think what Georgia maybe helps bring to the fore to some extent is a question of priorities for the coming administration, because the fact of the matter is that we want to respond very strongly to Russia's attack on Georgia, and at the same time we need Russia very much in order to address things like non-proliferation. Russia may very well be the primary source of fissile material should we be confronted with a nuclear terrorist attack or terrorists with nuclear ambitions in the near future. And so to an extent it becomes just a question of, to what extent do we value pragmatism over ideology? I mean, I tend to lean toward the pragmatic side, which is I think certainly we want to send a signal that this sort of invasion of a neighboring country is not something that we look favorably upon. At the same time, we've got to be very careful not to cut our legs out from under us, because the fact of the matter is it's far more important for us to maintain Russia's cooperation in nuclear non-proliferation specifically than it is to send a moral/moralistic response with regard to Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, I do take issue with that. I mean, I think what's at stake is the international order, and I don't think that's, I wouldn't cast that in ideological terms. You know, I think that is an order that many countries, rising powers, established powers, all value for economic, political, military, and social reasons. And you know, I think it has a kind of almost inherent and fundamental value that isn't associated with any particular ideology. I think that's why you didn't see the Shanghai Cooperation Organization rallying behind Moscow in the way that Putin and Medvedev had hoped and said publicly that they wanted, that they thought would happen last week. They didn't get that out of the Chinese, and I think that is a reflection that you know, our view that this action, unilaterally redrawing borders, was a threat to the international order is actually shared. I think there's some acknowledgement of that in Beijing, and there's also, I think, among the Russian elite, some recognition of that, or some signs of recognition. I also really question Peter's premise that this is an either-or, that somehow by overlooking
That wasn't my
or downplaying what Russia has done, that will advance the cause of winning their cooperation on proliferation. I don't see.
No one's trying. I wasn't
that.
trying to downplay it. At the same time, I think, you know, calling for, let's say, immediate acceptance of Georgia into NATO may not be the wisest thing to do. I mean, the fact of the matter is we do have other interests here, and is the defense of, Georgian democracy, to this extent that it is democracy, the highest priority, and it's just not. So I think we've got to seek ways to balance it. But I do think it is far from an either-or situation, and it's one of these situations where it doesn't lend itself to particularly scintillating answers in a panel discussion, but it is a matter of balancing conflicting priorities, and we just want to emphasize that we do have very concrete interests in maintaining Russian cooperation going forward. That doesn't mean that we can't take a stand on Georgia. I think when relations between countries sour, that is often the time when we most need to cooperation on crucial things like nuclear cooperation.
So the answer to the question, it seems you all agree, but what principle is at stake is sovereignty. But you have different interpretations of how to think about how to pursue that.
I would just make one more plea, that we spend as much time trying to understand what the Russians were thinking as we worry about our own response. In many ways, this was their Grenada moment, as it were, and so that we are unlikely to be surprised in the future at the ways in which the Russians are likely to behave. We would do well to concentrate as much on what it is that they think they're doing as what we ought to do about it.
Let's just take two last questions because we're running out of time. One, two, and then we'll digest those both in last comments.
I'm Consul General of Czech Republic here. So I would like to return to the concept of religion because, I grew up in communist regime, which obviously was a religion as well. And if you look at American liberalism, it's completely religion, with all its tenets, with all dogmas and so on. The same happens probably to neocons and so on. So the thing is, if you speak about religion, you only choose one part of all the religions, and it seems like the human society can't work outside religions. So you should basically compare all ideologies and not just speak about religions only.
Thank you. I'm Judith Steam. We do have a very powerful military. We've got a great economy. But in thinking about this leadership, it seems to me that our model really should be Norway, because we have only 5% of the world's population. And if we thought of ourselves in that way, we might have a better view of ourselves, as Robert Burns said. The issue of sovereignty was put on the table by the United States, but our own sovereignty is absolutely intact. And remember all those SOFA agreements that we have with countries all over the globe? So my question, I do have a question, is was it smart, was it effective to put US money and troops into a whole series of Soviet republics? And having done that, Georgia might help us think about other Soviet republics where we, in fact, are moving in.
There was one other question there, the gentleman with the Apple laptop, that I wanted to capture before.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about Steve's point about the, quote, lucky scenario of the rest of the world to send us vast financial reserves. I think that often, this is a kind of statement that I hear from economists who value everything in terms of GDP and growth and economy, and gee, if we have more money, we must be better off than if we had less money. And I think that we might think about some of the consequences of that have not really been so lucky, that we've taken that wealth and we've used it as an opportunity to squander it and spend it in ways that have really not helped ourselves in the long run, while fostering a dependence on those capital flows that hurts us in the long run. So to me, that ties in with this question of understanding what's actually good for us and not necessarily just measuring it in GDP and economic terms.
Okay. Steve, you want to pick that one up? And if the other two want to go back to the broader question of the southern rim of Russia.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, right, rule number one of economics, when money is too cheap, people do stupid things. I would say the same thing about ideological competition on the world stage. A lack of competition makes people dumb, okay? This is a great opportunity for us, actually, to understand more fully what it is we need to do to establish a new era of American leadership. And in that context, I'll just put forward one notion which I think I want to leave on the table with regard to this kind of economic interdependence question. I think a really strong principle that fits very well with some core American values, which we ought to get serious about paying attention to, is, let's call it mutuality or reciprocity. If we believe in interdependence, and we think it's a force for good, and we think we've benefited from it in lots of different ways, let's recognize that interdependence operates in both directions. If we want to invest in other people's economies, then we have to permit foreign direct investment inside the United States. If we want to have a say in others' domestic electoral arrangements, then in fact we're going to have to open up our conversation here to their views of how our electoral system works. I think mutuality is something that we could take a lot more seriously than we do in all of the aspects of these relationships. And to my mind, that's actually something that fits extremely well with the core American values, that even though we sort of argued a little bit about how they should be expressed, we all sort of share what they are foundational.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on Steve's point a little bit about how the kind of reemergence of competition could be a healthy development, in that it forces the U.S. To be sharper and more effective in how we kind of wage our fight on the international stage. I agree with that, but I think I wouldn't underestimate the challenge we face in kind of recasting how we present ourselves. Because I think this is something, maybe we were good at it, effective during the Cold War, but I don't think we've been terribly effective, certainly not over the last 10 years, but even before that. I think we're not skilled and accustomed to, in our diplomacy, really focusing on persuasion and how you make the sell, not just how you articulate a position fashioned in Washington by fiat, but how you really engage in the art of persuasion and give and take and making a sell. And I think that's going to be a pretty fundamental transformation in our diplomacy, and a necessary one. And I wanted to come back to one point that Steve touched on earlier, which is whether kind of the locus of promotion of these values hasn't really shifted and isn't now kind of centered in places like India and Brazil. And what I would say is those may be the exemplars of what can be achieved through the realization of kind of maybe what we think of as American values, but their approach, those countries' approach to the projection of those values in their foreign policy is radically different from the U.S.'s, and it's very measured. It's almost non-existent. I think they really don't see it or haven't seen it as a part of their foreign policy to try to protect and advance those values. I think that's one of the reasons why sort of the premise behind this League of Democracies is so flawed, because it assumes that there is that shared agenda for not just embracing the values at home, but projecting them abroad. And I think how we, whether that changes is going to depend on how we engage in a dialogue with those countries about the role of those values in their foreign policy. And it will mean, kind of going back to Steve's point, it's not going to be a return to how the U.S. went about this historically. It's going to be kind of a new brand of shared projection of those values that's going to have a heavy dose of input and tactics that come from other parts of the world.
That's a very useful way to bring this to a conclusion and take us into the next panel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.